China was a feudal country for a very long time, and it remained so even in the 20th century till 1949, when the Chinese Revolution sent feudalism to its grave and also got rid of foreign imperialist control. Now, Chinese industry basically was handicraft industry based on small scale industry, and there was the appearance also of manufacturing in some sectors, but there was no development of large scale industry in the modern sense of the term in China during the period we are dealing with. And when we go on to deal with the development of industrial capitalism in China, we will have to keep three important features in our mind. The first feature is that unlike the Western world or unlike Britain, industrial capitalism in China developed not in an independent country. In Britain, it developed in an independent country. Britain was never colonized by any foreign power. But China was on the process of a transition after the Opium War, after the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and when feudal China was being transformed into a semi-feudal and semi-colonial one. So it was when China was undergoing this process of transition from one stage to another, it was at that point of time that large-scale industries were introduced into China. So the way industrial capitalism developed in Britain was different from the way it had developed in China. The second feature was that in Britain, industrial capitalism developed after defeating feudalism. Some of you must have known about the Wars of the Roses of the late 14th century, then the coming of the Tudor monarchy, then followed by the Stuart monarchy. And there was a rise of the gentry, dissolution of the monastic lands, rise of the gentry. And a new class emerged, which was a landowning class but with capitalistic tendencies. And then there was the mid-17th century civil war. And when industrial capitalism developed in Britain, it developed on the ruins of the feudal system. Feudalism was abolished, and in its place, we have the system of industrial capitalism in the case of Britain. But in China, what we see is that there was no abolition of feudal system, but an adjustment with it. So it did not arise, it did not develop on the ruins of the feudal system, but it made an adjustment to the feudal system. And the bourgeoisie, which played a role in the development of industrial capitalism, was called the comprador bourgeoisie, which acted as agents of Western capitalist bourgeoisie. That is the second feature. And the third important feature was that in the case of Britain, industrial capitalism developed as a result of the evolution of the indigenous society. It was an indigenous product with hardly any interference from outside. But in the case of China, it was a transplantation from the Western countries. There was no bursting of born by the peasants. There were hardly any technological development, which one can find in Britain. And the industrial capitalism that developed in China was an importation from outside. It was industrial capitalism which developed in a different historical context and which was superimposed on the Chinese soil. Here, the cases are more or less similar with what one can find in our country, that is in India. The emergence of China's modern industry began in the second half of the 19th century. A large number of foreign powers were very busy setting up modern industries after extracting one humiliating treaty after another from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government succumbed to all the Western pressure during this period, that is second half of the 19th century. One treaty followed by another, then by another, and so on and so forth. And in fact, from the 1940s, Britain started setting up modern industries in Hong Kong. British firms like Jardine, Matheson and Company enjoyed a monopoly over the opium trade. There were Indian collaborators, Indian businessmen, business houses like the Tatas, Birlas and others. They were very much tied up with British capital at that point of time. And they were instrumental in exporting Indian opium to the Chinese market. And at that point of time, British, American, French and German capitalists, they began shipyards, steamship companies, filiatures, brick, tea factories, printing presses in different parts, particularly in Shanghai, in Canton and in Amoy. Now, these industries were set up not with an eye to the economic development of China, but for the export of commodities. All were export oriented. There was a clearly export orientation. There was also the plunder of raw materials and cultural aggression into China. After that, we have investments in coal and iron industries, all in the second half of the 19th century. Not only foreign merchants, but Chinese compradors, Chinese scholar gentry officials, landowners, they also made investments as collaborators in those industrial ventures. Now, all these were heavy industries, not light industries, not small-scale industries, but heavy industries. Now, that constituted the first phase of industrialization. The second phase started from 1894-95, that is after the Sino-Japanese War and the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, which was another humiliating treaty. China had to sign this time with Japan after she suffered a defeat in the hands of Japan. And then foreign investments were there in the railways, in the mines. In the railways, there were different lines: Yunnan, Vietnam, Chinese Eastern, Peking, Hankow, Shanghai, Nanking. So these were new railway lines set up, of course, by the Western power or the other. And the Chinese merchants, the Chinese comprador merchants, were very much involved in all these undertakings. They acted as agents. And in this way, they accumulated a huge amount of money. Now, the word comprador is Portuguese. Literally, it means buyer or purchaser. Mao Zedong pointed out in his essay Analysis of the Classes in Chinese Society that a comprador in the original sense of the word was a Chinese manager or the senior Chinese employee in a foreign establishment. And in fact, a comprador was a bourgeois who had his interests tied up with foreign bourgeoisie. And he also acted as brokers, as middlemen, and served the interests of the foreigners. These compradors became very important in the economic history of China, and it controlled the economic lifelines of the nation. In China, the comprador merchants first appeared in the early 19th century in the port city of Canton. Canton was the only port which was legally opened to foreign powers at that time, though illegally there was some other ports also, Amoy, Lintin Island, Macau, etc. But Canton was a major port city which was only city legally open to the foreign powers. And it was in the city of Canton that foreign powers were allowed to establish their business houses. And there were the Hong merchants which were controlled by the emperor, and they had their farms, Kuhong, known as the Kuhong. And when the foreigners came, it was the Kuhong merchants who had to deal with their affairs, and some area was designated for some power, other area within the city of port city of Canton, and another area was meant for another European power to do business. So in this way, and China's early industrialization was undertaken mainly by these comprador merchants, of course, in alliance with the bourgeoisie, with the foreign bourgeoisie. And there were also the traditional scholar gentry, including high officials and merchants. One Chinese historian, Yan Ping Hao, he described the compradors as the bridge between the East and the West. They formed a liaison between the two parties. Now, besides industries, foreign banks were set up. Foreign banks were set up in the treaty ports, and after the Treaty of Nanking, 4 new port cities were opened: Shanghai, Amoy, Fuzhou and Ningpo. And they utilized the doctrine of extraterritoriality, that is, extraterritorial operation of foreign law on Chinese soil. And they set up foreign banks in those port cities. And the most important was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, known as the HSBC, which was set up in 1864 with a huge amount of capital, 20 million Hong Kong dollars. In fact, the control exercised by these banks, there were other banks also, Bank of China was another. Now, it was overwhelming. And in fact, they exercised much influence over the economy of China. Foreign economic aggression took many forms. First, there were direct foreign investments. The foreign imperialist powers, they controlled the whole of China's industry through the firms which they had opened in different parts of the country. And their factories were greater. They were greater in number than the factories owned by the Chinese. So that was one feature, direct investment. The second feature was that foreign investments in China were mainly commercial. There was a commercial orientation. As for example, in 1914, the total capital of foreign industrial enterprises was 1,000 million US dollars, of which about 83% were invested in commerce. So there was a definite external orientation, commercial orientation. And the third feature was that several imperialist powers dominated foreign commerce, foreign Chinese industries. As for example, in the late 19th century, or in the mid-19th century, we have 3 powers: Britain, Germany, Tsarist Russia, and France. These are the 4 powers. In the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, we have the United States and Japan, which aggressively pushed into China. However, there was a change in situation after the First World War and then after the October Revolution. After the First World War, Germany was defeated, so Germany was out of the picture. And after the October Revolution, Tsarist Russia was defeated, so Tsarist Russia was out of the picture. So Russia, of course, it was a new Russia. So both these countries were out of the picture. So we have 4 countries at that time: Britain, USA, Japan, and France.
Is there any difference between the capitalisms of India and China?
No, there are similarities. Basically, there is much similarity. In both the cases, in both the countries, we have handicraft production and the handicraft industry as the basis, emergence of manufacturing in some sectors, but no large-scale production. Before the advent of colonial rule in the case of India, and before the advent of Western capitalist powers in the case of China. In both the cases, first of all, in both cases, industrial capitalism developed in a dependent country or semi-dependent country. In the case of China, it was semi-dependent, one can say. In the case of both the countries, China and India, there was an adjustment with feudalism. New feudal classes emerged in India. Feudal classes definitely were there. They were the ruling classes, the scholar gentry, officials. And the third feature was that industrial capitalism was not the product of the indigenous evolution of Indian or Chinese societies. And in both the cases, it was a transplantation from the West. So there are basic similarities here between the 2 countries. Now, the First World War opened up new possibilities for the industrial development of China. One obvious reason was that it was a war situation, and so foreign trade was totally disturbed. Britain was very busy in the European theatre of war, not only in the European theater, but also in Asia also. Anyway, but trade was affected. And so the Chinese bourgeoisie, this time they were the national bourgeoisie, they got some sort of breathing space to develop new industries. And this was the second stage of China's industrialization, which embraced a period from 1914 to 1924. This period has been described by a scholar named Marie-Claire Bargier as the golden age of the Chinese bourgeoisie. In her opinion, this industrialization was imposed from above when the Manchu state played an important role in the last stage of its decay. In the earlier phase, the main needs of the state was the militarization and the development of heavy industries. That was also the period in the 19th century early stage. A number of peasant revolts, peasant rebellions had been taking place, and there was the need for strengthening the armies, armed forces, and that was another reason why so much emphasis was put on armaments, on weapons, arsenals, etc. Anyway, now, so there was, in the earlier phase, there was an emphasis on heavy industry, but in this phase, in a new phase, which started after the beginning of the First World War, we have the development of consumer goods industries, small-scale industries, light industries, etc. One can mention textiles, food, cigarette, sugar, hat, soap, glassware, napkin, carpet, sewing machine, wine, etc. So these were the new national industries. And side by side, there was also development of national banks. And here, the people who invested in these industries were not the comprador merchants, comprador bourgeoisie, but they comprise a national section of the Chinese bourgeoisie. The Chinese bourgeoisie was split up into two sections, the comprador and the national. And here that was a period of the efflorescence of the national bourgeoisie in China. However, they could not develop much because soon after the end of the First World War, there was a reversal to the old situation. So foreign powers again came, new powers. Japan became very aggressive after that. The gradual penetration of foreign powers into China from the second half of the 19th century deeply disturbed the Chinese social structure, besides other things. Now, Chinese society traditionally was based on a four-class hierarchy. Scholar officials, called Shi in Chinese, or the landowners, landowning elements, they were the ruling classes. Peasants were Nung, artisans were Kung, and then the merchants, that is the Shang. This was a Confucian concept. Now, this concept was thrown overboard as a result of the new development, and we have the emergence of new social classes, no doubt. The first important social class, of course, was very active commercial bourgeoisie, the comprador bourgeoisie. And they minted money out of their foreign connections throughout the second half of the 19th century. And then we have, of course, there was also the national bourgeoisie that developed during that period, a new bourgeoisie. And then we have the working class. Whenever we talk about the bourgeoisie, we also talk about the working class, because without the working class, the bourgeoisie cannot exist. And as the Chinese national bourgeoisie got some sort of a breathing space during the First World War, so Chinese small and medium-sized industries developed, and a large number of workforce got absorbed in many industries. There is a book by Sheno on the labor movement in China, a very authoritative book on the labor movement in China. According to Sheno, during 1915 to 20, the total number of workers employed in the textile industries was 3 lakhs in some major centers. Shanghai was the most important industrial center at that time and even later. In the chemical industries, we have 1.19 lakhs. In the food processing or foodstuffs industry, we have 1.5 lakhs. In the metallurgical industry, we have 26,000. In miscellaneous various other industries, we have 35,000 workers. And apart from the workers, we have the modern intelligentsia. It was a very distinct social group, despite the fact that it was closely tied up with the bourgeoisie. And this intelligentsia was no doubt the product of Western education during the last days of Manchu rule. And it was these scholars who replaced Confucian. They brought about changes. In fact, there were late Qing reforms which brought about changes in educational system. A new educational system, Western type of system, replaced the old Confucian type of system. Universities were set up, technical colleges were set up, middle schools were set up. Many people were active, journalists were very active, and many of them teachers belonged to provincial associations, etc. And in fact, the young students, studying in the schools, high schools, studying in the colleges, both men and women, and they played an active part in the May 4th movement of 1919. Now, apart from this, the capitalists, industrial workers, the intelligentsia, there were also petty traders, craft workers. They were also there. And they constituted a very large portion of the Chinese people, Chinese workforce. And then, of course, there were the peasantry. Peasantry was not a new social class, but they constituted the overwhelming majority. And they suffered all types of oppression by the feudal system, which was very strong, despite the fact that there were some industrial pockets in some sectors. Industrial capitalism in China developed in a dependent country with adjustment with feudalism, and it was not the product of the indigenous evolution of the Chinese society, unlike what we find in Britain, but like what we find in India. That is number one. And there were 2 stages of industrial development. One was in the second half of the 19th century, when there was emphasis on heavy industry. The comprador merchants were very much active. The comprador bourgeoisie was very much active, and they had their interests tied up with the foreign merchants. And in the 20th century, particularly during the period of the First World War, we have the development of small and medium-sized industries which produced consumer goods. And then we have a changing social structure, emergence of new social classes, the commercial bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, the intelligentsia, the working class, and the petty bourgeois and craftsmen. And ultimately, it was the working class, definitely, and the peasantry, which were to play a decisive role in the future history of China.
Do you think that the development of the new social classes in China is somewhat in tune with that of the West? Is it somewhat similar to that of the West? Or if it is not so, then what is the basic difference?
No, working class developed in China in response to the emergence of industrial capitalism. There was one similarity between the West and China, initial period, when industrial capitalism was initiated, came in Britain, particularly during the Chartist movement. Artisans, handicraftsmen were thrown out of work. There was a loss of work. And they took to machine breaking, Luddism, which is called Luddism, destruction of machines. Machines were destroyed in the West because they were causes of unemployment. In the case of China also, there was destruction of machines. There was Luddism, Chinese Luddism in China, But machines were destroyed in China not primarily because these were causes of unemployment, but primarily because these were foreign. All these were foreign techniques. So they resisted. That is one that comes to my mind. The other thing is that China is a very big country, is a feudal country, unlike Britain, which is a very small country. If we take the percentage of the working class population and compare it with the percentage of working class population in England, then Britain compares nowhere. In the sense that Chinese workers were smaller in number in comparison to the total number of population in China. In the case of Britain, it is a sizable number.